I first came across the aircraft that I now call my Expat X-Air a few years ago, back in April 2008. Back then though, she was just plain Golf Papa Whiskey. At the time, a friend was looking for an ultralight aircraft, and when I found Papa Whiskey for sale up in northwest England, I thought she'd fit the bill nicely. We drove up to view her, and after we both had a chance to fly in her, he decided to go ahead and buy her. But then my involvement ended, because just afterwards I acquired an aircraft of my own that was going to need all of my time over several months to get it airworthy and flyable again. 3 years later, during which time she remained unflown, we turned our attention back to Papa Whiskey, and after having her engine completely overhauled, in April of 2011 we had her flying again. Over the next few months I had the opportunity to fly Papa Whiskey from time to time, as in this clip from July 2011, flying out and back past Rochester and the River Medway from Stoke Airfield in Kent. I didn't know at the time, but that was to be almost my last flight in Papa Whiskey for several years, because in May 2012 I left the UK for a new home in France, where I subsequently acquired a French X-Air of my own, followed by a gorgeous Savannah and a lovely little French AX3. I flew my Savannah from France to England in 2016 and made it back again 3 years later in August 2019. This time my friend asked whether when I arrived I could give him a hand with Papa Whiskey. He said that he couldn't get her engine to start, and he'd also been told that as she hadn't flown for several years, it would be difficult and costly to get her re-permitted to fly in the UK. So when I eventually laid eyes again on Papa Whiskey, I was pleasantly surprised. What issues there were only problems in the UK, but not so in France, where the regulatory regime is far lighter and such matters are left up to the discretion of owners. In the UK she could well have been a goner, but in France she could take to the air again with minimal formalities. So I had an idea. I'd take her off my friend's hands, transfer her to the French register and fly her out to a new home in France. Unfortunately, it then took a month for Papa Whiskey to get a new French identity, 24 Zulu November, and the time lost was subsequently to prove very costly. On returning to the UK, I removed her old UK registration and applied her new French one to the underside of her wing. I strengthened her covers along the edges of her ailerons, elevator and rudder, and replaced a perished rubber fuel pump mount, none of which took very long to do. All I then had to do was wait for an opportunity to get away, but by then the weather had turned, and eventually, after arriving in the UK on the 4th of October, on the 25th I gave up and went back home to France. But I hadn't given up hope completely. Even as November arrived and the weather worsened, I still thought there was a chance that I'd be able to complete the flight before Christmas. So I drove back to the UK again, arriving there on November the 8th. The next day, Zulu November had to leave the barn where she had been stored for the last few years. As there was no chance of flying out that day, the main priority was to get her covered and safely parked outside in a sheltered spot, sealed up as far as possible against the expected overnight rain. As the nose section of her outdoor covers had been mislaid, I had to quickly make up a temporary piece of an old scrap of white dacron. That having been done, I then left Zulu November for what I hoped would be just a few days, until the weather window that I needed materialised. There were a couple of possible opportunities to fly Zulu November out, which I unfortunately missed. The first time she had a flat battery, and the next time, Headcorn, where I wanted to go to load her up and file my paperwork, was closed while the air ambulance was on site due to a nearby car accident. I eventually took off to fly her there when it reopened the same day on what was a fine winter afternoon, but too late to leave that day for France. After leaving, Zulu November parked overnight at Headcorn in order to leave early the following day. The next morning it was too cold for the battery to crank over and start her engine, so once again I didn't make it away. Although her engine started and ran later on, I couldn't contemplate heading off with the risk of ending up somewhere in France with a dead battery. I had to get a new one, and as I didn't want to leave Zulu November at Headcorn while waiting for the new battery, as she couldn't be tied down there, I arranged to move her to Clipgate Farm. I flew her there later that same afternoon against a strong headwind and tied her down there for the next few days. Zulu November was parked in the open at Clipgate with her nose into the southwesterly wind, which was by then beginning to increase in strength. Although I did my best to make her as secure as possible, when I returned the next day, I found that she had been tipped up by the wind onto her tail skid. This was not unduly serious, but I nevertheless decided to turn her round and lash down her outdoor covers as they were billowing up in the wind, which by then was very strong and could have ended up being ripped to shreds. I received and fitted the new battery, and it looked as though there might be another weather window to depart the following day. However, when I arrived that morning, the temperature was still below freezing, and Zulu November's horizontal surfaces were covered with a thick layer of hoarfrost, making a takeoff impossible. So the time had come to finally admit defeat. It looked as though there would be no chance of getting away any time soon, and by then, not only were the days too short, but central France was also being battered by strong gusting winds, which would have made it dangerous anyway to fly in such conditions. So it was time to pull the plug and find a temporary safe home for Zulu November. That turned out to be the new hangar at Clipgate, where she will remain probably until early March 2020. Hopefully then I'll be able to write the fourth and final chapter of my Expat X-Air saga, once I succeed in flying Zulu November out of the UK to her new home in France.